Thanks for having us, Al. So this panel, I think we got about 40 minutes, and we're going to go through a couple things and talk about an airplane that, an airplane actual example. Please feel free to ask questions, but we'll start off, if I can just we'll start with you, Jim, but just a quick introduction.
Sure. I'm Jim Sellers. I'm the manager of the JSSI parts organization within JSSI. We are supporting all of the JSSI hourly cost maintenance events with material, engine leasing, as well as piece parts. We're also supporting third-party customers and third-party opportunities through the acquisition of rotable inventory, aircraft acquisitions, and part outs. Again, we have about 25 engines and APUs in our lease pool and a pretty wide variety of rotable components.
Hi, I'm Bob Wilke. I'm a managing director at AvRisk, which is a small consulting and appraisal organization just outside of Detroit, Michigan. And we work with banks and leasing companies to help manage the aircraft in their business aircraft, in their portfolios.
Hello, Greg Miller. I'm a longtime engine guy. I was Standard Aero for quite a long time, then Pratt & Whitney Canada. Went with a private equity firm for a little while, and then I've been on my own for a year and a half brokering aircraft, and I'm quite connected with a lot of aircraft part-out companies now.
Okay, great. If we can get the first slide up. So everyone take a look at this, and if you can get up that first question too. So, so here's a real-life example that Greg's going to take us through. This is Michael Jordan's, I think, older airplane, and it was a little bit old. It's 1991, and so in that first question, can we put up the first question for the audience? What did this airplane end up selling for? So, Greg, I'll let you just kind of walk through that as they get the question up there. If you can just kind of walk through the particulars of this.
Got involved in this aircraft not too long ago. It's obviously kind of neat on who it was, being Michael Jordan's plane. He had purchased something else. This aircraft was for sale, and we looked at a lot of different things that were due on it. You can see the 12-month, 24, 36, 48-month inspections were due within 4 months. No ADSB, no fans. The gear was almost cycled out, and you know, it was obviously going to need paint and interior. The interior was quite unique. It had white seats with Carolina blue striping on it. So, you know, but the interesting thing was it was 100% covered on an engine program. So the engines we knew had more value than you know, almost anything of the aircraft and continuing to fly. So after you know, we looked at it, talked to multiple part-out companies. It ended up going to a company that took it and.
But Greg, when you were going through that process, was it ever you were trying to figure out the highest value, either a sale or from a part out, or was it just pretty clear right from the start it was a part out?
On this particular one, we knew it really needed to. It was going to cost more to run it through maintenance, paint and interior, than the aircraft would ever be worth. So really the engines were the prime key as to what the value was on the plane. And the main key is what we call glass, gear, and APU. You know, the windshields, the gear, the APU, and obviously the engines are the main value. Now the problem we're seeing with the G4 and G4 SP is the leading edges. If you have to replace the leading edge for corrosion, they're running almost $600,000 per side. So it's, you know, it's $1.2 million to change the leading edges on these, and they've got a problem with pitting corrosion on the back side of the leading edge. So we didn't even take the plane through a pre-buy. It wasn't worth it. But I guess before I tell you what ended up happening with it, I know Bob wanted to mention he wanted to run an appraisal on it, and then we can compare what our notes were.
Yeah, so there's a part out value that Greg will talk about that, and then Bob's going to just kind of run through kind of the appraisal of selling it as an airplane.
Yeah, and before that, I just wanted to give those that are 25 years roughly and younger a rundown. This aircraft began production in 1986. and continued through 1992. At that time, a total of 196 aircraft were produced. Back in '86, the average retail delivery price was $16.4 million. In 1992, its last year of production, it was $24.8 million. And back in 2008, the average value in the marketplace was $22.5 million. These aircraft had actually appreciated in value. Now we're looking at retail values of between 2.3 million and 2.2 at wholesale. The thing to remember there, that is an aircraft that has been compliant with ADS-B, is compliant with ADs and service bulletins, and really has nothing wrong with it. Do we want to go to the...
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So we can go to the appraisal slide and see kind of where things go in this particular marketplace. But before we do that, we have a quiz.
What's that?
We have the quiz.
Oh. Yeah, they already got the question up there. So, all right, we'll get to the price there again. So just looking like most people think is kind of under 1.5. But if we can get to the next slide. There.
So for this particular example, I just did a very, very quick overview of what we're seeing aircraft selling for and also what the pricing guides utilized. Right now, the average selling price is 2.18. Average wholesale is, well, I sure hope it's not, well, maybe it is 2.4. However, this particular model was overtime in hours and landings. It had some inspections that were due imminently. And what we've done there, if you can see the slide, is broken out what those inspection costs will be. And it's going to require a landing gear rebuild, no ADS-B out. So those are our deducts from the value. Coming back to that Blue Book estimate of 2.45, those deductions bring the quote-unquote estimated value to 1.5 and change.
Okay. And then, so Greg, if you can kind of just walk us through what ended up happening to this airplane and then walking through the numbers. So, realistically, this is an appraisal, so theoretically, if you were to sell it on the market, it's a value of 1.5, so it would probably sell for something less than that. If you were sold as a plane, then what happened?
Well, and actually, in this case, the seller was wanting in excess of 2 for it. 225, I believe, was the number.
Might mean Michael Jordan was.
What's that?
Did he own the airplane when you were doing this, or?
He didn't. No, it was a lease back. Well, it was
Okay.
returned off the finance company. So a finance company had it, and the ask was 2.2 and some change. Multiple bidders came in on it, and I don't know if we want to go to the next slide.
Next slide. Yeah.
We can show you. So it ended up getting parted out, and it sold for very close to $2 million. And the engines were its main value, and the part out company that took it said they ended up having some positive revenue out of it, even paying close to $2 million.
So the leading edges, you mentioned the leading edges are $600K a pop on each side. So it looks like they were taken off. Were those sold as well?
They would have been. I haven't checked with them to see if they were actually sold, but everything was pulled, put into their inventory. The engine sat for about 6 months, and then they were sold as well. They're now flying. They were 100% JSSI covered engines, so that was the majority of the value. They sold just the 2 engines for about 1.6.
Okay, so then the total cost you're saying was somewhere between 1 3/4 and $2 million for what the sellers end up getting for the airplane as part out.
The seller ended up with close to $2 million in purchase price, and then of course the part out company hopes to. Their goal was to recoup about 2.3 to 2.4 after selling off all the parts.
All right, and just to go to the next slide. So, and we'll kind of change the slide, but I guess that's Michael Jordan's new airplane right there, which is
that's the replacement. I don't know if anybody's seen that or seen pictures. I thought it was leopard print the first time I saw it, but it's actually the bottom of one of his Nike shoes. That's the same print.
So I mean that's interesting. We'll touch on the kind of the part out the part out at towards the end here, but I know we were talking about this earlier today, but with the ADS-B out, with that deadline coming up January 1st, 2020, that's obviously going to be affecting these older airplanes that are needing to get it and whether it's worth to doing it. So if we can kind of get up the next question too, on that one for the audience. And then also just to kind of talk about, and we'll start off with you, Jim, about ADS-B and how that'll affect older aircraft, and Bob and Greg, if you guys can kind of chime in too as well.
Yeah, we had a great panel up here earlier that went through ADS-B, and you saw charts and graphs of around, at what percentage of the aircraft that are out there are currently compliant, which is interesting because I think everybody out here, I think, is concerned with the ADS-B and the value of the particular market, and especially the aged aircraft, 15 to 20 years, and older aircraft. And it really comes down, I think, to the value that the owner or operator has in that particular machine to figure out whether or not it makes sense to put the cash forth to go ahead with the installations. They can be anywhere between roughly 80 and 150,000, and we're seeing a drop in aircraft values on those aged aircraft, which basically make it BER. So the owners and operators are taking a hard look at whether or not is it worth the investment? Is it worth the investment to maybe go buy something different or something new? These considerations are currently underway, and we're seeing the drop in value on the 15 to 20-year-old aircraft, where owners and operators are not interested in proceeding with the ADS-B implementation. So they're looking to remarket and resell the aircraft, and taking into consideration the fact that the aircraft doesn't have the ADS-B complied with is lessening the value, which is bringing more aircraft to the part-out market. Aligned with that is it's kind of under the same principle of, if the aircraft value is less than the maintenance that's going into it, well then it may not make sense to proceed with the foregoing maintenance.
So from a big picture, that's obviously going to, when that deadline comes or approaching, it should increase the amount of retirements that will be happening.
That's what we're anticipating, and what we're seeing. The initial indication is that there's going to be more aircraft, owners that are sitting on their hands kind of waiting to determine what they're going to do, and it's going to put them behind the 8 ball, and the aircraft are going to be parked, which doesn't obviously suit the mission of their particular aircraft. So ultimately, we think that's going to lead to more availability of aircraft, put more aircraft in the market, drive prices down on those aged aircraft. But there's still value in the engines. There's still value in the components off of the aircraft for those aircraft that have been compliant. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out come 2020. But the initial indication is that, yes, the prices are going to go down on some of those aged aircraft because of availability. We've already seen people move, or owners and operators move, to resell their aircraft knowing that they're not going to proceed with the ADS-B, and the impact on the values.
Mm-hmm. And what about and Greg and Bob, what about the slots to actually get the ADS-B work done between the next 2 years?
Everything I heard, the slot issue is the issue. This particular aircraft I found very interesting. I did a little bit of research on it, and of the 196 that were produced, 177 are still flying. And you're talking about production that began in 1986. That to me was just unbelievable. I thought, maybe half the fleet, but significantly more. But, it seems to me that...
And I would imagine for the Falcon 900, which is about the same time of production, I don't know how many those are, but I would imagine the same percentage are still flying around. There just hasn't been a lot of retirements of older aircraft because they're just approaching that age right now.
And now what you're looking at is kind of what is the cost to fly these aircraft? What's the cost to maintain them, to upgrade, to be compliant? You factor all those things in, and then, hey, is it not worth it? What can I get in a part-out situation? And that's kind of what's driving the entire decision-making process.
Chris, I have to wonder, when the slots are booked, January 1 of 20, we've heard from your colleague that said that the planes can't fly in a metropolitan area above 10,000. That effectively makes them unflyable. So if a current owner has an expectation of doing ADS-B, and in his mind he's waiting on a slot, maybe February, March, April, at some point after that aircraft has been sitting for several months, future maintenance is coming due. I wonder how many people kind of change their mind about, do I really want it? And then there's more potential. I think because of the slotting, I think there's going to be more potential part out. And I don't think ADSB is driving the part out. I think it's just one of 5 or 6 bullets in the bucket for the decision to part one out. Because, ADSB, frankly, is not that expensive compared to the cost of the whole aircraft. But when you add up multiple maintenance
Yeah, it just could be the straw that pushes over. And Greg, we were talking the other day, I was fascinated by this, about, you traditionally think, you sell what did you say, the engines, the windows, and the gear?
Yes.
Okay, so the most valuable things, and the APU. And then so theoretically you have a carcass left, and then, that's scrap metal. And you think, wow, you could get at least something for the scrap metal. But you were explaining that it doesn't really work like that.
Yeah, the metal is contaminated with paint, the zinc that's on it, and an entire fuselage. That Jordan's serial number 1177, the seller that bought it and parted it out, the buyer, could not even get anyone to come pick it up.
He couldn't give away the fuselage.
No, couldn't even give it away. He had already given away so many to the local fire department, the airport, museums, schools. It gets to be a problem. Actually, it's a burden trying to get rid of the fuselage.
I mean, he literally was having a hard time to pay someone to come pick it up. I mean, yeah, which is, I thought that was pretty fascinating. I thought, you at least could get scrap metal value for it. But kind of talking about that, if we can kind of get the next question up there. Okay. So when we think about the kind of the next 5 to 10 years, because I think we're going to see a lot more retirements, and so for part out candidates, it's a function of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a function of, it's really going to be a part out candidate if it's like that G4, where there's still like 90-something% of the fleet still flying, so the parts have value. Where if it's an older aircraft and there's not that many of them flying around, the part out value is not going to be that high. So the next question now, we can get. We'll have a question up here of different type of candidates and what aircraft we think would be the best candidates for part outs. If one of you guys want to kind of take that.
Yeah, I think maybe what are we going to see in the next 5 years? There's several planes have already kind of made their run, and the Hawker 800s, some of the Falcon 50s. It gets to the point to where the fuselage isn't even worth any money, and you're only picking off maybe just the engines off of it. And so there's a period when, as you mentioned, the aircraft fleet is no longer flying. Even buying the airframe to part it out isn't worth the money to do so. And one thing I wanted to point out, it's very interesting. I mentioned that on Jordan's planes, the engine were 100% JSSI engines, and there was a value there because there was a lot of the fleet is not on a program. But when you go to a plane like a G200, that 94% of the fleet is on a program, you can't sell the engines because everyone that's on a program is not a customer for an engine because they're already paying someone to handle their problem with the engine when they come due.
But then the person that has the programs is the buyer of those engines. Would it not make sense?
Potentially.
And that's where I think JSSI parts and the structure that we've created, we can value the aircraft a little bit higher than maybe somebody that's purely spec buying because we do have over 4,000 engines on our program, and there's value for us. Instead of issuing the lease agreement with the OEM, we can use our own rental bank to support our lease requirements. So as we have some aircraft up here identified, we're seeing like the Falcon 2000, for example, Honeywell's repairs on the earlier serial numbers on those engine overhauls are well in excess of the value of the entire aircraft, and that presents some challenges. And they're even having some production challenges where they're starting to take engines out of service and use material to support those engine overhaul events. So it's an interesting dynamic. We're seeing curves with other OEMs, engine OEMs, where they're driving the aircraft to a more favorable position to be viewed as a part out because there aren't alternative shop options. Either they have the exclusivity on the repairs and the values continue to go up, their new list prices for replacement parts continue to go up, which diminishes the entire aircraft value in terms of whether or not to proceed with a maintenance event when the entire aircraft value is less than 2 engine overhauls.
So you're talking about engines going through a second overhaul. That really hasn't happened in any kind of meaningful way in the business jet market, has it?
Well, in the Falcon 2000, absolutely. I mean, there's a midlife and there's an overhaul, and the midlife is about 50% of the overhaul. The overhaul cost per engine could be anywhere between 1.5 and $2 million.
No, I'm talking about, so what's for the Falcon 2000, how many hours is it?
I think it's 8,000.
Okay, so it goes through the overhaul at 8, and then when it comes up, I don't know if there's any that are approaching that second kind of either the second midlife or the second overhaul at 16,000. I mean, that just hasn't really happened. They just don't last that long.
Right, it's that first overhaul, though, that's driving the values.
Of course.
So a lot of them haven't gotten to that point, that utilization.
So when you were looking at like these G4s where, some of the NetJet airplanes, they've got approaching 15,000 hours when they're out there flying. So those airplanes are never going to go through another midlife or another overhaul, I'm assuming. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Because, I mean, that could be the limiting factor of where now we're having these 30-year-old airplanes that are approaching those, those mid-teens of hours, thousands of hours. They're not going to go through another overhaul event, are they?
Well, I think they will on the engine side. I think they will on the engine side. As long as they're covered under a program and they've been prepaid for, you tend to see those planes keep flying. In the case of Jordan's, it was on a program, but somebody valued the engines more than putting close to $1 million in the airframe. I think we'll just continue to see that. We've got a lot of the NetJets birds that you mentioned. I know on the Excels that have a lot of time, they're on a program with Pratt, and when they come off the NetJets program and go out into the corporate market, they can have an option of transferring to a different program under Pratt's ESP plan. So to me, I see as long as the engine program is intact and fully covered, there's a very good chance that the plane keeps flying until you get to when it's, if you just have one airframe event or the landing gear's due, it's when you have 4 or 5 come together at the same time. I think each individual plane is going to be specifically looked at to decide whether it's worth it to continue flying it.
So is there any potential liability for a JSSI or a Rolls-Royce or Pratt & Whitney that own these programs of people kind of riding them out to kind of go through those events, when they're really high time?
I mean, the liabilities there under the contract and the agreements for, the OEMs or for a JSSI. But I think, through some of the efforts that we're making and through the JSSI parts organization, we're able to supplement some of those costs, manage it a little bit more effectively. So it is interesting, and I think the NetJets point is
because there'll come a point where if someone's, you're on the hook for an engine that's got, really high time and it's expensive to do it, a lot of times it might just be better for you guys just to go buy an engine that, was recently overhauled and just put it on, just buy it on the market.
Right, if the owner is willing to accept it.
Yeah.
On an exchange. But the NetJets option or the NetJets example that you had mentioned is interesting because I think a lot, the number of Falcon 2000s that are going to their second overhaul, I think it exceeded the expectations of the OEM and has really put them in a bad spot. And I think, we're seeing those declining values as the NetJets is looking to move out of the Falcon 2000. So.
Well, I think on the NetJets Gulfstream aircraft, they run on condition and they've got a 10,000 hour limit. And then you overhaul it, boom, go into another 10,000. However, if they change ownership and NetJets sells that aircraft to someone, they revert back to the original maintenance schedule on the engines.
Hey, there's an interesting question up here. So, Greg and Bob, going back to Jordan's 91 G4. So, what would have happened if that wasn't on an engine program?
It would have probably been worth into the 400 to 500 range.
400 to 500,000, and that's just you're just kind of adding up the parts that you could sell.
Yeah, that's just the frame and the engines at that point are cores. They're worth about 50 to 80 grand a piece. The engines just they had no program.
Okay.
I mean, those we're not too far away from from an engine event, if I recall, and so you're down to core value on it. So the only thing that gave that thing any value was the money that had been paid into the program. I did see one other question on the Challenger market I wanted to mention. The 601s have almost run their part outside. There's so many CF34-3 engines on the market right now available. There's not very many 3Bs. There's actually a very high demand for 3Bs. They can go on the CRJ 200. I'm working a 1998 Challenger 604 right now. They're 100% on-point engines, and the seller wants $4.2 million for it. I've already been offered $3.2 on just the engines. Another airframe company has offered $500,000 on the frame. So right now we're about $700,000 apart from what the seller wants. And gut feeling is in another couple of weeks we'll have that deal done, and that plane will be parted out.
So who are the players out there that are buying these parts or buying the engines? Is it kind of fragmented or?
Yeah, it's anybody that has the need, right? So there's some FBOs that are looking for frame parts. Now the engines, you actually have operators specifically looking. If they're not on a program and they need an engine, they're out shopping for it. And I've been in that community for so long. You've got people reaching out to me, every week, looking for a variety of different, anything from an old Citation, up to G4 engines. So it's quite a big mix.
And whenever you swap out an engine like that, and especially when you're just making one, bolting one onto the airframe, if I'm looking through the maintenance documents, now I've got a whole host of different issues to consider on that new, quote-unquote new engine. And that's the other thing to really look at. Even if you're going to part it out, take a good look at the maintenance records on that airplane. You want to know what it's been through, where it's been flying, what environmentals it's been exposed to.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. So what, and this is a generality, and I think it's different for every airplane, but what's the crossover point where the cost of maintenance is so high that it doesn't make any economic sense to continue the operations of the airplane?
Boy, I don't know what the percentage would be, but you just look at the economics of what the plane's worth. I mean, we keep going back to Jordan's G4, and it was going to need $1 million worth of maintenance, and based on Bob's report, the plane was really worth, 2-3. So it just didn't make sense to put it back in the air.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, every aircraft is different.
Yeah.
What is required. If there was a ratio or a formula out there, I would be thrilled. I haven't been able to figure one out. Mm-hmm. But, it's a great question.
Okay.
She had a great answer.
So if you guys had to pick one aircraft that over the next 5 years that's going to be kind of the next best kind of airplane as a part-out candidate, what would it be? And you can go down to even the kind of the lighter jets as well, too.
Well, Brad, I think it's the list that we came up with collectively as a group for the questions. I think that's what we're going to start seeing now. The Citation XLs, that one's going to be in demand for parts. You can't get engines right now. Engine overhauls that aren't on a program are running anywhere from $800,000 to $1.2 million per engine. And to my knowledge, there's only been 3 XLs parted out. No XLSs or XLS Pluses yet. There's been several Bravos parted out. We went through a rash of those in 16 and 17. There was probably 12 Bravos that have been parted. Encores are in demand, because those planes are still flying, right? So in that 545A engine is on so many other flying aircraft right now. It's a very high demand engine for a part out. So if you get one that's, maybe needs ADS-B, Wi-Fi, a major airframe inspection, but still has time on the engines, that plane will be parted out to harvest the engines.
And looking at the G4, the next logical aircraft is a G4 SP.
Yeah.
What happens after that? Well, nothing. I don't know of anybody else that's got a TAE engine on it. Maybe you run it as a generator in your basement when the power goes out. For me, I would say that the Falcon 2000 would be a pretty darn good candidate. You know, the 604s, you can roll in the 605s, and those airplanes are pretty darn bulletproof.
Yeah.
And it's a constant evolution, right? As aircraft reach a certain age, I mean, to expand upon the list, you're getting into, you know, the G5s, the G4SBs, and then even into like the Global Express aircraft as well, where you're seeing maintenance costs on the engines in particular that are exceeding the value of the aircraft.
So if we take some other questions from the audience, if you guys want, we have a couple minutes
I
left.
did see one, Chris, that somebody said, how do you know when the market is too saturated and you can't even part the plane out and make any money? The guys that do that on a daily basis, you know, they know, because they know what parts are moving. And by the way, there's a term in the industry that people use when they part one out, and they call it knocking it in the head. And they'll say, yeah, we're going to, and the engine too. So you've got engine people, and then you've got airframe people, and they're typically not mixed. And most of those guys partner with each other, and they'll go in and buy an airplane. The airframe guy takes the frame, he'll buy the plane, and then he sells the engines to the engine guy, and then they both say, well, we're going to knock this in the head, you know, and knock them, part them out. And, you know, the parts get tagged and put on the shelf. And then as you're talking to people in the part out business, and you say, hey, what's moving right now? Or if you ask for a particular, you want to sell another engine to them, and they'll say, no, we've got buckets of those on the shelves, they're not moving anymore. You know, I'll give you pennies on the dollar for it. I mean, that's kind of when you know when the guy.
So you got to make money on the part out. If you're an owner of an older aircraft that's going to be a candidate for a part out, there's a window where it can be lucrative, and if you miss that window, you're kind of out of luck, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's a handful of them now. I mean, you know, Beach Jet. They're a Beach Jet with run-out engines. It's $50,000 for the whole plane, because the frame's worth nothing. Maybe the windshields if they're good, and each engine's worth about $25,000 a piece.
The core.
Cores.
And just out of curiosity, what are they doing with those?
What do they do with them? People will buy them for, you know, 50 to, well, there was one that just sold last week. It was, I was watching it. I put in a bid for it for 50 grand. Somebody paid 140, and they'll probably have a little more in it than they want for it, but they try to harvest the high turbine blades out of it. There's a few key things in the engine that you can pull out of it, and the engine shops will buy from you.
So a takeaway for a lender, if you're looking at, and I know a lot of lenders don't really finance older airplanes, but if you're looking to finance, say, something in like the 95 to 2000 kind of vintage of some of those airplanes, you know, that's about 20 years old now, as a lender, you got to, in your mind, you got to probably come to the realization that your borrower is going to be the last owner of that aircraft, and there's really no predicting if he's going to hit that lucrative part-out window, if it's going to be worth anything.
No, that's exactly right. And the one thing I wanted to mention before we lose time, somebody said, should I part a plane out for an investment? So it typically, for a average size business aircraft, it's about $50,000 to part one out. It's what it costs you to do it. Now you have to inventory the parts, so you need a warehouse, and you're going to sit on that money for about 36 months to sell it all off. That's kind of.
But theoretically, you'll sell the big stuff relatively quickly, the engines.
You hope to, right?
Or have them pre-sold.
Yeah.
I would imagine probably people like to have the engines kind of pre-sold before they buy the.
Well, certainly, but you've got people that'll inventory them. You know, I've got good friends that have 80 engines in inventory right now that they can't move them. So they build up inventory. At some point, they'll have to knock it in the head and part it out for parts then, instead of the whole engine being sold. But so it's a tough business. I mean, there's a handful of very good people that are in it, you know, supplying overhauled condition parts. And it's not just the $50,000 you're spending. You have to then send parts out to have them overhaul tagged. So all the parts that you want to resell, people typically won't buy an as-removed part. They need a 8130 dual release tag.
It's probably why there's not a lot of people doing the part-out business.
Yeah, right. I mean,
It requires infrastructure, right? Marketing, sales efforts, and then you have quality control as well. I mean, you want to make sure that you're selling quality parts back into the market. Without that quality control, you can put a bad stigma on your own business or on the market itself. So, quality is a big part of everybody's in everybody's purview, and through the part out process and the recertification of parts, it takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, it takes an infrastructure, excuse me, to really support that effort. So just on a personal basis, just to part it out, I think you'd be a bit, it'd be in over your head, I think, if it was just a one-off activity.
Okay. Any questions?
I see a couple, Chris. I wouldn't mind answering.
Go ahead.
How old
Go
is
ahead.
too old? I mean, West Wind. That's too old. There's some that people just won't even touch. As I mentioned, I did see another question about is there ever going to be an Amazon, for business aircraft? There kind of is, so to speak. You've got the parts base and ILS that people use to sell their parts, but it just gives you a list of who's selling it, and then you go direct to that person selling it. I think some companies have tried to do a online selling of parts, and I think with an aircraft part, you need to see the tag. You need to have a return policy if the tag's rejected or the part's rejected. So I mean, I don't think there can be an easy web application for it.
I tell you, we were talking about the 400, and that's one of my all-time favorite aircrafts. And what blew my mind is when Nextant really didn't excel in that rebuild space, zero timing them out. And if you've ever been in a 400 that has the interior pulled for a major inspection, it's like Homer Simpson had a Heathkit thing, and he was soldering wires together in the floorboards. I mean, you're seeing the solder joints. It's amazing, but I still love it.
Any more questions? If not, then I think we might knock the panel on the head, split it back to its consistent, split it back into its parts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.